Hello, welcome. This is Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to be talking about what's the deal with indentured servants. I wanted to talk about this in part because of a news story that keeps popping up like a whack-a-mole every couple of years and has resurfaced in the summer of 2020. And that is the idea that Irish people were slaves in colonial America. So, some background. This story has circulated for a couple of years now, and it tends to pop up every time the United States has a discussion about the issue of systemic racism and how it affects people of color, right? This notion that people of color today suffer pervasive effects from racism that is ingrained into our culture, into our institutions, and that this dates back to the legacy of slavery. And a lot of times this story of Irish as slaves pops up not to demand justice and historical recognition for people who were enslaved Irishmen, but rather to push back on this notion that African Americans were unique in their experience of historical enslavement. So were Irish people slaves? The short answer is no, they were not. Irish people were not slaves in colonial America. So, why is it that this story keeps coming back like a zombie? It's in part because this is a misunderstanding of the historical kind of labor that we call indentured servitude that was used a lot in colonial America. There are big differences between indentured servants and slaves, but before we talk about those differences, it might be helpful to give us a basic definition of what exactly an indentured servant is. So, indentured servants were people who signed labor contracts, like the one that you see on the screen in the left. These labor contracts were for the servant to work for the contract holder, usually dubbed the master, for a set period of time. Now, the amount of time a contract lasted could vary. Most adults who signed labor contracts to be indentured servants served between 5 to 7 years. If they were children signing up for indentured servitude, yes, that did happen. Oftentimes, this term of service would be until they turned a certain age, like, for example, 21. So, this person is signing a contract for a set period of time. And this contract not only outlines the responsibilities of the servant, right, to do tasks as asked to by their masters, but it also outlines the responsibilities of the master and their end of the contract. In particular, the master is required to provide food and shelter to their servant for the duration of the contract. And they're also required to give them what we call freedom dues when their contract is done. So basically, an indentured servant wouldn't really get paid for their term of service until the end. And that would come as a lump sum payment in the form of cash, tools, livestock, or what most indentured servants really wanted, land. So we'll talk about why they really wanted land shortly. But basically, this is an agreement between two parties. So the person who is signing up to be the indentured servant is doing so typically voluntarily. So, why do we have this system where somebody might sign up for a period of time to work for somebody else? This system we see not only in the English colonies in North America, but also in the Dutch and the French colonies in North America. And this was meant to solve the problem of how do you get more people to settle these North American colonies. The indentured system came up because it provided benefits to both the holders of the contracts, the masters, as well as the servants. For the masters, especially in the English colonies, having more servants might actually get them more land. In colonies like Maryland and the Carolinas that used the headright system, anybody coming into the colony got a certain amount of acreage per person they brought with them to settle. So If you wanted to go settle in, say, the Carolinas, and you not only had a wife and kids, but maybe a couple of servants or slaves, you would get more land than if you just went yourself. So there are some benefits there for people getting more land out of having these servants. Indentured servitude is also a fairly cheap form of labor because it's temporary labor. You're getting these people only for a couple of years. That way, if they don't turn out to be the best worker, you're not tied to them permanently. It's fairly affordable because you don't have to pay them until the end of their contract. And I should mention, you only have to pay them if they survive the term of their contract. If an indentured servant died before their contract was done, there was no requirement that the master pay the freedom dues to their next of kin. Pretty much, they weren't responsible for those freedom dues at all at that point in time. Considering that the first 100 years of the English colonies, the mortality rate was very high. In other words, people were dying younger and faster than normal. This meant that there was a good chance that indentured servants would not survive to the end of their contracts. So this made them relatively cheap and affordable for use by masters. What benefits do servants have? Well, masters typically had to pay the cost of the ticket to get to the colonies in the first place. It was incredibly expensive to sail across the Atlantic to the English colonies in North America, so the master absorbing these costs made it possible for some of these people to go. The servant also got food and shelter for the duration of their contract. And as I mentioned, the freedom dues, as long as they lived to actually get to the end of the contract, usually had a high incentive rate. Most indentured servants really wanted land at the end of their term of contract because the English identified land ownership as your key to being an economically independent individual, a self-made man. So the idea was that these indentured servants were willing to sign up for these contracts and endure a period of time being someone else's servant if that meant that they could establish themselves as an independent person at the end of their contract. So, as I mentioned, though, there are challenges, particularly the fact that the death toll is pretty high. So, who would sign up to be an indentured servant in this system? Mostly poor people, people who can't afford to go on their own to strike out to the New World. A lot of Irish people did go over as indentured servants. During this time period, England had conquered and colonized Ireland. In fact, much of the method of conquest and colonization in Ireland was then used on Native Americans in North America. And many of the language that the English used to describe the Irish sounds very similar to that they describe the Native Americans as savages, as uncivilized, because the Irish are culturally different and also Catholic. So many Irish people have been pushed off of their lands, dispossessed, and so for many of them, North America represented a chance to potentially start over and be more successful. Same thing for poor British people. The enclosure movement had pushed a lot of peasants off of the land, not a whole lot of opportunities to get work in crowded cities. And so, again, this was seen as a chance, a risky chance, but a chance for a better life elsewhere. After 1700, we start to see a interesting kind of indentured servant contract, one that contracted entire families to work for the contract holder. This was most often done by German families who could not afford the cost of tickets to get over to North America. They got the nickname redemptioners. They would sign up their entire family for a period of indentured servitude so that they could make it over to the Americas. So this does sound like a dicey deal for indentured servants, but they do have certain advantages legally that slaves do not enjoy. Indentured servitude and slavery coexist in colonial North America for a period of time, and there are big and important differences between them. I mean, on the surface, they look very similar. These are people who are working for a master. They may not be working under the best conditions, right? They're unfree, but there's a key difference, and that's in the legal definition. So, indentured servants in the legal system were seen as people. They had signed a contract, right? And they served the duration of that contract. But because it was a contract, they could sue their master for breach of contract or abuse. Now, it was still difficult for them to do that, and many indentured servants actually chose to run away because that was a little easier than filing a lawsuit against their master, but it was possible because the legal system saw them as a person. Indentured servants were only temporarily unfree for the duration of their contract, and if they had children while they were indentured, their children were not doomed to become indentured servants as well. Now, most indentured servants did not have children during the time of their contracts because, number one, they were forbidden from getting married while they were indentured. And number two, if you were a woman who did manage to get pregnant during the time of your indentured servant contract, guess what? You just had 9 months added to the term of your contract. Yes, your contract was just extended to compensate for the time period you were pregnant. Now, this is a big difference from slaves because in the English system in the colonies, slaves were not defined as people. They were defined as chattel or property. What does this mean? This means, in the simplest term, I like to give an example of what happens if you kill a person, because this will show you just how different the status of indentured servants and slaves is. Let's say you kill an indentured servant. At that point, you would be arrested and tried for murder because you had killed a person. If you killed a slave, if it was somebody else's slave, you would be arrested and tried for property damage because they were not seen as people in the legal system, they were seen as property. If you killed your own slave, nothing was done. Slave is your property to do with as you wish. If that sounds messed up, it's because it is. So, because slaves were seen in the legal system as property, they could not sue for abuse or breach of contract. Now, this wasn't always the case in the French and the Spanish colonies. For example, Louisiana, which alternated between French and Spanish control, slaves could actually sue masters for mistreatment, but not so in the English colonies. Slaves were permanently unfree, and if they had children, their children then became slaves permanently as well. These two factors, the idea of slavery being permanent and a condition that could be passed on to your children, make American slavery very different from other forms of slavery that had existed in world history. This meant that the system of slavery was very difficult to escape. It was often possible for slaves to purchase their freedom or for slaves to be emancipated or freed by their masters, typically as a term of will right after the master is gone. But it's still very difficult to do that. And in fact, states will actually make it harder for slaves to become free, especially after the year 1800. So this is the big distinction between indentured servants and slaves. Slavery is a permanent condition, and slaves are not seen as human, whereas indentured servants are only temporarily under this contract, and they do have legal rights because they're seen as people by the legal system. Now, indentured servitude and slavery, as I mentioned, coexist in colonial North America, but the balance between which of those forms of labor are used and preferred starts to shift after 1676, in particular because of what happens in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion. No, it's not a bad case of food poisoning. Bacon's Rebellion is named after Nathaniel Bacon, who was a white property owner. I was a little miffed at Governor William Berkeley because he wasn't in Berkeley's inner circle of favorites. He felt that he and a lot of other actually Western planters in Virginia felt that Berkeley didn't listen to them or respect to their needs. In particular, Western planters were concerned over attacks from Native Americans. They felt that Berkeley gave political favors to his buddies, and so Bacon was mad at this exercise or this misabuse of power by Berkeley. So Bacon decided to gather together a rather motley crew of other disgruntled white landowners, poor white people, many of whom were former indentured servants who were upset that their freedom dues at that time did not include land and also usually didn't include enough money to be able to buy land. And so they had come over for a better life and they found themselves still poor because they couldn't get freedom dues that were of high value. He also appealed to indentured servants and to slaves by promising that they would overthrow Berkeley, that they would establish a more fair system, and give indentured slaves and servants their freedom and benefits like land. Well, Bacon's Rebellion went well initially. They actually ran Governor Berkeley out of Jamestown, but eventually the British Navy came back in to restore order. Bacon had actually died of illness during the rebellion, but many of his co-conspirators were found guilty of treason and executed. Bacon's rebellion served as a wake-up call for the political establishment in Virginia. They didn't like the idea that poor white people and enslaved black people had joined together to try to overthrow the system. So they made a couple of changes to ensure that nothing like Bacon's Rebellion would happen again. Number one, they required that any future indentured servant contracts in the colony of Virginia must include land as freedom dues. They were trying to do this to eliminate the number of poor white people who were left kind of in between at the end of their contract. They wanted to make sure that they were more economically stable because economically stable people usually don't protest and try to overthrow the government. The other thing that they started to do was started to encourage the use of slave labor rather than indentured servants. Why? Well, because slavery was a permanent status and slaves were property, not people. And so they felt that this would stop any labor unrest because, again, masters could harshly punish their slaves without any kind of legal repercussions. So Virginia and many of the other southern colonies start to move away from the use of indentured servitude and shift more heavily to the use of slave labor after Bacon's Rebellion. Now, indentured servitude will still be pretty common for another 100 years. Indentured servitude really starts to take a nosedive in popularity in the wake of the American Revolution because many indentured servants see this type of labor contract as a violation of their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as promised by the Declaration of the Independence. And indentured servitude will only be sporadically used off and on after the American Revolution, mostly in cases of people who were seen as wards of the state, so like orphans or foster children, as a way to kind of provide for them. So the next time somebody asks you, were Irish people actually slaves? Hopefully you'll be able to take some notes from this presentation and say no, but they were part of a labor system that was crucial to the establishment of the colonies. And there were many similarities between slaves and indentured servants. But at the end of the day, only one group, the indentured servants, were seen as people. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.